Hey guys, welcome back to the Func Med Nation podcast. I have the pleasure of talking to an not that you're old, but our friendship is old, dear friend of mine, Dr. Tom Culleton. Tom, thanks for taking time. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here with you, Steve. Love it.
Yeah, it's right now, like we're sitting 3.5 hours away from each other. And we're here in Texas now until probably the end of February, somewhere around there, although kind of negotiating with my wife about what time to leave. But I'm going to try to make my way down and so I can see your mug directly in front of my eyes.
And well, it's been a while, right? I mean, it's been way too long. So obviously with what's happened over the last couple of years has really derailed a lot of individuals getting together and being Canadian, both being Canadian, getting back home. I haven't been home. I want to get home. I miss everybody, my good friends, my family. So I want to get home and say hi to everybody. So that would be happening here in a couple months. So I'm excited for
There you go. Good for you. And so maybe we'll talk about that. I mean, you and I talked right before we started recording that we've got kind of a general outline of topics to talk about, but the impact of the pandemic on functional medicine practice wasn't something, that I had on that list, but, I had perhaps an advantage over a lot of docs in the fact that my practice has been virtual for years. And so I really didn't see any impact on mine. And I know that your practice has kind of morphed and changed over the years since you've been doing Func Med. What kind of impact did the pandemic and the lockdown have on you? Like, did you have a blend? Because I don't remember us ever talking about this. Did you have a blend of brick and mortar and virtual? Were you doing mostly virtual? Like, what was, just kind of tell me how it hit you.
So I had the brick and mortar, and like you and like so many other practitioners of Func Med, the demand becomes very high, and not everybody can necessarily see you in public and or in person. Sorry. And so for me, like you, I started getting more into the virtual world, which was a blessing, to be able to do that. And then what started happening was because of the way the market is here in Austin, Texas, I own the office condos that I practice out of. And so there was demand for it. So I chose to rent it out to another medical practice. And so that was a good step that allowed me to focus even more on the virtual.
Right.
But like yourself, a lot of my time was and efforts were put into travel, into teaching functional medicine across the country to all the practitioners. So you know how they always say not to put all your eggs in one basket, right?
Yeah.
So I think 90% of my eggs in that basket were relying on seminars for one form of revenue, and I had my patient base, because I always think, and Steve, I know you share the same thought process, is if you're going to be an instructor to tens of thousands of practitioners around the country and the globe, it's important to have a pulse on what's going on with patients. You have to actually see patients so they can give you a dose of reality, because any of us can get up there and teach physiology and this is the way it should be, ideally, and in theory, this is all how it's going to be.
Right.
But I think we have to always keep in mind that, we have to see some patients. So even though the majority, because I wanted to step back, I was getting stressed in my clinical practice. So it was nice to kind of step back, have somebody rent out my property to focus on teaching and some traveling, and to have virtual patients. So that's kind of how I was going into the pandemic. But I was leaning heavily on the instructing seminar side and not focusing so much on patients, or not on patients, but on patient volume, if we will, trying to attract and build the practice. And it was all really just referral based. So I was no longer spending a lot of money on monthly marketing, like so many of us have done. So I was really basing it on, in-house referral. And so basically what happened was, the pandemic hit, and then I wasn't really seeing a lot of patients, a load of patients. I easily could have seen more, but that's when our good friend, Dr. Steve Giannopoulos, he and I were communicating, and we kind of created a new business model during that pandemic. So the pandemic allowed us to create something that never would have been, maybe not never, but it certainly lit the fire to what do we do to help practitioners around the country, and to help patients around the country, and maybe not necessarily rely on just our clinical practice. So it went from all the eggs in the brick and mortar type practice to all the eggs in the seminar basket, to putting eggs in a virtual. And now, we have this other business for lab interpretation for other practitioners. So I would say that the pandemic, although it stole a lot of quality time in people's lives from family visits, etc., it allowed me to, and I don't want to use the word pivot because everybody's using that pivot word, but allowed us to initiate something that we always wanted to do, it just never pulled the trigger on.
And it's funny that there's so many shared experiences. Like at this point, I've interviewed for this podcast like a dozen people in related to different aspects of the functional medicine world. And there seems to be a common theme, whether it's related to the pandemic or just someone who's been doing what they're doing for a long time. It's, that old saying of necessity is the mother of invention. And I can go back through my own 25, like when did we graduate? 95.
Whoa,
like
Steve,
20.
we met in St. Louis in May of 1992.
That's right. It was 92. That's right. Yeah.
That's right. And then I had to take a semester off. So then we weren't able to be in the same class anymore. So you graduated before me. I graduated December 95.
Yeah, I was August, September. Yeah, so one semester away. But I can look back over the last 27 years or so and see certain kind of milestone periods of time where I had to do something different, and part of it was like, for example, back when the economy crashed in 2008-ish, you find yourself with your back up against the wall and you literally have to reinvent yourself. And, as you're talking about how not having all your eggs in one basket and you've got multiple different streams of income. I mean, obviously you can't do each of those things full time. And so on one end of the spectrum, you have guys like you that kind of spread yourself around a little bit to insulate yourself against some of the external forces that either you can't predict coming or you can't control when they do happen, like the lockdown and the pandemic. And then you go the other extreme. And I talked to, Chris Turnpaw, also a mutual friend of ours, who arguably has the largest functional medicine clinic in the country. And he's opening a second location and just duplicating the same thing that he's already done. And that seems like, I have a basket full of eggs and all my eggs are in this basket. Let me get another basket and do exactly the same thing. And those are almost diametrically opposed. And what I love about the profession that we're in, and I've said this to many guests already, is like your practice can pretty much be anything you want it to. So, I mean, was this for you? Was this kind of like an organic growth thing? Or did you sit down at some point and strategically say, this is what I'm shooting for, and this is how I'm going to protect myself against those external influences I can't predict or control? Or did it just kind of happen?
You mean for the new business or?
Well, everything. I mean, just like, because you got your hands on a couple of different things. You're a property owner. You and Genopolis have the Read It blood chemistry interpretation service, and then you still see your own clients and you still speak. Like, again, is that the manifestation of a strategic thought process, or just, I don't want to put things in your head, but how did that come about?
Sure. Well, I think it was interesting. I think as time goes on, for me personally, the urge to travel and to see things, see the world, is important. And I think if I had to do it all over again, I'd be like, our good friend, Dr. Mike Murphy, and some other individuals, where I would have a clinical practice, and like Dr. Turnpaw, where you have a clinical practice, then multiple doctors under you, so you can step away from the practice. And it doesn't impact your finances on a daily basis. So, right. So when you're a solo practitioner, you don't necessarily have that advantage, right?
Yeah.
So I kind of wanted how do we introduce a method of still being able to see patients, but not have to be chained to your brick and mortar to do that.
Right.
And so the virtual world certainly allows, as you know better than anybody now, the ability to have mobility.
Yes.
And I heard a great term from the Canadian Sachin Patel. Is it
Sachin, yeah.
Sachin.
Yeah, I'll be talking to him in about 2 weeks.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
But the concept of, global freedom, right?
Yes.
So the virtual practice allows you to have that global freedom. So, I was lucky. I took my mom over to France and to see all of her brothers in the Channel Islands between England and France, in the English Channel, the Jersey, the original Jersey.
The original Jersey.
And it was fantastic because I was able to have communication with patients, but also to be able to do all of our lab interpretations. So it allows you to go and see. And I think, kind of circling back to your question, was it wasn't like this. It wasn't all planned out. But I do remember, it's a good 7-8 years ago now, some of the clients that Steve Janopoulos and I have with our lab interpretation company, that started 7 years ago, just as these were high volume wellness chiropractors, healthy practices. People in their town love them. And they love what we do in this world of metabolic subluxation, if you will. Like how do we identify these metabolic issues? But for them, they're so busy in their practice that, they don't have a way of introducing it. So we thought, well, why don't we do that part for you? Why don't we help you? So you focus on what you're really good at. And then we're kind of good at this piece of the puzzle. How do we unite that? So I would say, Steve, that it wasn't, a big grand scheme. I always thought that I would just have my solo practice and stay busy and work in it and adjust patients and see neurological patients and then retire out of that. I never foresaw that we'd be doing virtual world and having a lab interpretation company being able to do that while I'm sitting in Saint Malo, France at 10 o'clock in the evening.
That's right.
Having a nice hot chocolate was fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've said in many of the seminars that I've taught, you have moments in these seminars where you kind of talk about your personal experience and perspectives, and it's not just all just the rote physiological learning. And I've said to many people, like, if you had asked me when I graduated, or even within the first 10 years of practice, did you ever see yourself, number one, doing Func Med, number two, teaching to an international audience, is what it turns out to be. That wasn't even close to on my radar. And for me, in my first 10 years of practice or so, nutrition, even though I personally, I guess, ate relatively healthily, I didn't take a lot of supplements. And as a chiropractor doing kind of brain-based musculoskeletal work, to me, the only nutritional acumen I had was like, fish oil and glucosamine sulfate. Right. And so Func Med wasn't really on my radar until it was. And for me, it was like a massive eureka. And so let's go back, because when you graduated, you went to Rome, New York, and you had a high volume practice there for years.
Correct.
And you were a very well-known and in-demand functional neurology seminar teacher at that point as well. And that happened quickly out of college for you. And I know your story, but just for the people who are listening who may or may not know you, how did you get exposed to Func Med, and what was it about functional medicine that caught your attention? Because you were already very successful, and you were already entrenched in the functional neurology world. So how'd you get started in Func Med? And then what was it about that made you think, hey, I need to do this?
Well, it's interesting, Steve, we just kind of go back all the way. Like, so, in the university, at the University of Windsor, initially I wanted to be a teacher. Mm-hmm. And of course, back home in Ontario, becoming a teacher is incredibly hard to do. It's probably the hardest thing in the country to become is a teacher. They pay very well, and of course, the time is adored by all. And so I couldn't make the grade. And then when I decided I wanted to be a chiropractor, as you know, there was only one chiropractic college in all of Canada at the time.
Right.
And so I just didn't have the grade. I couldn't make the grade. I was never going to be able to get into CMCC. So went to Logan, and that's where we met. And then during Logan, about a year to go at school, that's when I got introduced to the functional neurology world with Dr. Carrick. I got fascinated with that. And so as soon as I graduated, became board certified, and then myself, Mike Powell, and Ted Carrick were the only people in the world at the time teaching functional neurology, which was kind of a, it was a neat thing as a young kid coming out of school. And and so had the high volume practice in upstate New York. And then Thursdays were my neurology day. That was, I'm only going to see 3 patients that day, and we're going to spend hours together doing a lot of things to try and improve your health. So then in 2008, when I moved from New York to Austin, Texas, simply because I was tired of shoveling my roof, So when I moved to Austin, Texas, I had to practice maybe for about a year, and then got introduced to the functional medicine world. I was teaching a seminar actually in Chicago, and Joe Serpi, who was practicing in Illinois, I was teaching the cerebellum in Illinois. And Joe Serpi came up to me and said, hey, this thyroid, he started talking all this thyroid. I'm like, Joe, what do you know about thyroid as a chiropractor? So he said, you really need to go to one of these Apex seminars. So I went, got introduced to Dr. Datis Karazian, and that kind of opened my eyes a little bit, simply because, as you know, Steve, in the functional neurology world, how are we doing okay with the, it seems like I'm glitching a bit here. So doing okay?
Yeah, you've paused. Yeah, you paused a couple of times, but for the most part, you've been pretty clear. Okay.
So I was teaching cerebellum in Chicago, and Joe Serpi said this, this model of talking about thyroid and thyroid health. And he said, you need to watch this Datis Karazian. So in our world of neurology, as you know, the very first module that we teach of the 3-year course is neuron and neuron theory and the health of the cell, and that the cell needs oxygen and glucose. And that's all we would say when we would bounce on to, but it also needs activation. So we always talked about light in the eyes and olfactory and auditory and vestibular stim, and how do you drive brain activity? And oxygen and glucose just was sitting over here a little bit.
Yeah.
So when I first met Dr. Karazian at a seminar in Atlanta, I'll never forget. He said, "Tom, let's go to lunch together," because he knew me from the neurology world and
for the program.
Knew me as an instructor, and I think he just wanted us to sit down and have a little chat. And that's the first thing he said to me was, we were sitting down, we went to Whole Foods, we grabbed a little bit of sushi together, and he said, "So Tom, you've been teaching all this neurology, and you don't do any of the labs, you don't do blood work, you don't investigate that?" I said, "No, I don't." He says, "You teach neuron theory though, right?" I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "You talk about oxygen and glucose?" "Yeah." He says, "But you don't measure oxygen and glucose, and you don't look at any of that on any of your patients?"
And you're like, uh-oh.
And, if that wasn't, a brick to the head, that was a wake-up call.
Yeah.
And so, Datis, it was great. He just said, "Hey, listen, we're having our speakers annual meeting for Apex Energetics in 2 weeks. I want you there." So I went to that meeting in California. You were there. You and a whole bunch of the other docs that I maybe knew but didn't really know. Yeah. And there was a dozen of us sitting in that room probably, and we were going over this model of functional medicine that I didn't know any of it, and I don't know if I've ever felt more intimidated in a room.
Wow.
Leaky gut, what
which is
that?
That's amazing to hear you say that, because at that point you had taught thousands and thousands of doctors, and I think you taught over in Europe a couple of times too, didn't you? Either England or Denmark or something like that. And so it's not like you weren't used to standing in a room full of 100 doctors of varying degrees of experience and education, talking about some complex stuff like cerebellum. it's, you'd almost think that it would be hard to intimidate you.
Yeah, I think I've heard that a couple times, but I was definitely intimidated in that room.
Yeah.
And I think too, Steve, it's really interesting because again, that seminar that kind of kicked it off for me, teaching cerebellum, right? Yeah, I'm teaching cerebellum, and I had a lot of the cerebellar cases, and we show case videos of, someone with an incredible tremor that's, a genetic disorder that this patient had. And he's had it for, 40 years and nothing can be done for him. And he comes into our office and we adjust him and put some warm water in his ear to activate his vestibular cerebellum. And then you see his tremor go away, and it's all recorded on video. So I'm thinking, man, I own cerebellum. Like, right. Nobody can top what I mean, from a clinical perspective. And then, I see the case about having cerebellar antibodies, and I went, what's a cerebellar antibody?
Yeah.
I never heard of that. That's ridiculous. What? Autoimmune against, I don't even know what you're talking about. And then you hear that it's called gluten ataxia, that celiac disorders and the antibodies against your gut from eating wheat. Those same antibodies, and like celiac disease or gluten, it's not a gut issue, that the majority of the time it's neurologic, and that it can impact your cerebellum. And then that famous case, of course, where the one individual was diagnosed with like a Lou Gehrig's disease, and this is published in Nature.
Yeah.
And you're thinking, all right, Lou Gehrig's, and I know we've both had patients who had Lou Gehrig's, and the ALS diagnosis is certainly tough and certainly difficult to relate to a patient. But you see this case of this gentleman who basically has Lou Gehrig's, and when I present that case, I go through the whole thing. This is classic Lou Gehrig's, hyperreflexia, with wasting and weakness, like all day, every day. You're thinking that's going to be, this model of Lou Gehrig's, and sure enough, that the patient had celiac disease, and all he did was stop eating gluten, and the MRI changes, everything shifted. And when I saw that case, that was it. I mean, that was the brick to the forehead. Then the floodgates opened, and like you and Chris Turnpaw and Steve Giannopoulos and my good friend Martin Gabala, who'll be on, we all have this curse. I just finished watching all the Harry Potters with my daughter, and there's the curse, and I feel that we're all cursed with the insatiable appetite for knowledge.
Yeah,
we are never going to stop.
Yeah,
it just. I tell the story, as you said, sometimes at the seminars, you have to get away from just the physiology. My brother is a talented mechanic back home in Windsor, Ontario. He fixes brakes on the city vehicles. And for a timeline there, he worked on the Formula One circuit as a mechanic. He went from being a diesel mechanic and using sledgehammers to change brakes to going to the F1 circuit and going, like, was that too much? That little adjustment?
Wow.
And so, for him, when he goes home, he's not tortured like you and I and all of our colleagues are. He doesn't sit home and go, how do I adjust that brake a little bit differently? How do I make this happen? He doesn't do that. We go home and it's like, open this, here's that rabbit hole, takes us down that rabbit hole.
Yes.
We can't turn it off.
Yeah.
My brother goes home, cracks a cold beer, and as a hobby, makes guitars for the greatest bands on the planet. Yeah. Never knew how to play guitar, just wanted to build himself a guitar. He's left-handed. It costs double the price. So he said, I'm not doing that. He buys some wood, builds a guitar, brings it into the guitar shop, says, can you tune this? Because I have no idea how to play a guitar. Guy said, where did you get this amazing instrument? He says, I built it. He says, I'll give you $2,000 to hang it in my shop. And he said, not a chance. And so he went from that to now I'm talking to him on the phone. He's like, Tom, I got to let you call. U2's on the phone. Tom, I got to let you call. It's Van Halen. Tom, I'm like, you tell Van Halen that you're talking to your brother. I mean, who's more important, But I guess the point to that, Steve, is I think my brother has an incredible quality of life and that he gets to go home and enjoy. And I think for us, we all go home and we enjoy as well, but we enjoy getting caught up in the nitty gritty of going down the rabbit holes, because we have this curse, this insatiable appetite for knowledge that can never be turned off. And I know for you, when you teach us, I'm sure if I went to see you teach a seminar now, one that you've taught 100 times over, it is markedly different.
Yes.
Because the clinical patient has taught us everything. And what we thought we knew, it's markedly different. I think that's the gift of a good instructor, right? Someone who still sees a patient, someone who, because you get, there's so many things. And I know you add slides, like here's a different patient case scenario. And I think that, I've probably added 800 slides to the original 800 slideshow that we usually teach, just because we can't stop, we can't turn it off.
Yeah. Let me ask you this, because I thought about this when you were talking just 5 minutes ago or so. You were talking about the need for, or I don't know about the need, but it's advisable for people who teach to still have their hand into the clinical side, right? Because we learn functional medicine case by case, right? We say people in seminars all the time, you don't learn this stuff by sitting here listening to me or someone else talk and reading slides or whatever the case is. You learn by working with real people with real problems. In the last 5-7 years, there's, this emergence of the whole biohacking community, which may have started with Dave Asprey back with, the Bulletproof Executive and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not knocking these guys, because I think some of them have brought a lot of really cool insights to the table and have brought things up to kind of our collective awareness that, I didn't really ever think about that. But now every Tom, Dick, and Harry has got a YouTube channel or a podcast, and they may not even have any experience in, let's call it like the biological sciences. And they're out there talking about, well, this research paper says this, and if you take this supplement, it's going to do this. I do believe that there are some guys out there that don't have clinical experience, who have some valuable things to say. But what's your opinion of this whole biohacking thing and these self-proclaimed experts that are out there that a lot of the clients we're treating are listening to, and either, texting or emailing me questions? I just listened to this podcast by so-and-so, and he or she said this, shouldn't I be doing that? Like, that sometimes drives me crazy. So what's your opinion on that?
Right. Well, a couple of ways to come at that, right? I think it's funny at the seminars, I do always mention that, 10 years ago, patients would come in with, they've been to everybody type of scenario. They've heard great things about all of us as practitioners. What can we do differently to help? And so we would be able to say, we are going to test things that other practitioners haven't tested. We're going to look at you from a different paradigm. And we're going to talk about and investigate for leaky gut, and talk about this powerful modulator called glutathione, and we're going to talk about these things. And now patients come in and they say, okay, doc, listen, I already did my MTHFR testing, and I know that I have an MTHFR, so I'm really worried about my glutathione status. And when you look at the model of this methylate, and I go through this process and they are educated now, and obviously that has a lot to do what's available by a lot of these individuals that are biohackers. And biohackers, from the standpoint of people like Dave Asprey, again, like maybe he's not like a licensed degree medical professional or such, but you have those individuals. Then you have other individuals who are credentialed, if you want to use that terminology, that certainly also promote, here's the steps for longevity, or the steps to biohack, and it's, to me, here's something I find very interesting. Steve, I think when we first got into the world of functional medicine, patient comes in, we would cast a wide net, right? We would say, we're going to do every test we know under the sun, and it's going to cost you $6,000 just to get all this, just to get the testing. And I think the better skilled you become, you need less and less, and you kind of get back to the basics first. Let's clean up the basics, and see if we can move you forward. But even with all of that and with all the biohacking, you know, when I go across the pond, across the Atlantic, and go visit my mom's brothers that are over in Jersey, and they're having a cigarette and drinking a
pint of
whiskey.
Guinness.
Yeah, having a whiskey, having a given, having a lager. All right, lad. You know, when they're sitting there, and I'm trying to explain to them this model of gluten and dairy, and they're like, for Christ's sakes, lad, what are you getting on about? What, you know, they have zero exposure to all of that. You know, my mom, you know, is almost 80 now, and all her brothers are right up there. They're just golfing every day, having a great time. My dad's been hit by buses. He enjoys pints. He doesn't care what he eats, and so the whole biohacking and the whole longevity model, you know, to me is really starting to shift here lately. Like I was really starting to, yeah, you got a cold plunge, you got to take the ice cold baths, you got to take the ice cold showers. But what if you're someone who absolutely cannot stand that? Is there a negative experience associated with that can negate perhaps the good experience that the benefits you're supposed to attain from it? And you know, I know you've read the blue zones. You know, we look at these blue zone maps, and what does it all boil down to? And I was listening to a psychologist the other day talking about it really all just comes down to, are you happy? You know, are you happy, and do you kind of have a purpose every day? My mom, you know, she's as active and fun as can be, and she has Hashimoto's autoimmune hypothyroidism, and she doesn't pay attention to gluten, to dairy, and she doesn't do any of that. None of it.
Right.
Her whole world every day is working up and serving at her church and helping, you know, for the longest time, because my brother and then my three sisters back home, and everybody had kids, and my mom's full time and always helping everybody out. And, you know, patients always ask you, well, what about like George Burns, who smoked a cigar every single day and died at 100? So
I know, like, yeah, I mean, he's one of my favorite examples, and called it the George Burns effect, right? A cigar and a scotch every day, you know, probably more than one cigar for sure.
I think for those that are struggling, I think a lot of the biohacking allows them to introduce some things that they perceive that are really going to help them. And I think that's beneficial. I think they find joy in that and a great sense of accomplishment. I think there's a lot of power in that.
Yeah.
And perhaps for a lot of those individuals, they too are cursed like us with this insatiable appetite for knowledge. Like, how do I continue to get better? I think another individual cursed with that, even though I never met him, but Peter Attia, I think, you know, it's funny. I saw a post yesterday. He was talking about there was a bumper sticker on a Ferrari that he saw, and it begged the question for him, like, who puts a bumper sticker on a Ferrari? And he had all this stuff, and I thought, you know, he's tortured with the detail in every single thing that he sees, and how does it apply, and how do you? So I think, you know, he's doing a good job of exposing a lot of people who are biohackers, and he's I think has a new book coming out soon about longevity. And again, I look at it and think about my family. Everybody lives to their 80s, no matter what happens. Yeah. The amount of drink, the amount of alcohol, the amount of smoke, the amount of what, like, doesn't matter. Yeah. So how resilient are we innately? And how happy are you, I think, is really probably one of the biggest drivers. So for myself, that's what I'm striving for now is. Yeah. And I think that circles back, Steve, to what you're saying is I want some global freedom. I want to be able to help patients and help practices, help doctors, help their patients. But I'd like to be able to do it from Spain.
Yeah, that's right.
See places and to enjoy some cultures. And I think
I'll tell you, there's so much in what you just talked about that I would love to keep exploring. You know, just quick story. You were talking about, you know, there are people who don't pay attention to a lot of things that we do, whether that's gluten or whatever the case is. My dad, who just turned 85 back in Newfoundland, just got diagnosed with colon cancer. And, you know, we're still waiting on visits with specialists, we know it hasn't metastasized. It's a single primary tumor, so it's in a pretty good spot. But like your uncles over in Scotland, my dad eats and drinks whatever he wants. He doesn't smoke. He did before I was born, but he quit when my mom got pregnant. And he doesn't pay attention to any of that stuff. And he's, sure, he's on a blood pressure medication. He's on something, he's on a statin, he's on metformin, but his quality of life at 85, like I just spent the summer this past year in 2022, back in Newfoundland on kind of like the old homestead where he was born and lived in a small fishing community until he was about 10. We still own property back there. And he was side by side with me as we cut down trees and limb them and burn them in an old hollowed out oil tank. And we did that all summer long. And he's 80 freaking 4 or 5 years old. He was 84 at the time. And so it's that kind of stuff. And my wife laughs all the time. Well, what do you think? He's a Newfoundlander. You guys all live with these diseases that are supposed to kill you for a very, very long time. I had a aunt that she didn't die until like the next surviving spouse. She passed away a couple of years ago. One of his older sisters died at 96.
Yeah.
And she's picking up all her friends and going to church every Sunday, driving everybody around at 96 years old.
It must be the moose stew, Steve. It must be the moose
that
stew.
Could be the moose stew and the
seal fin soup,
seal flipper pie. So, I hear what you're saying. And I guess one of the reasons why I brought up the whole biohacking phenomena is that there's a tendency not just for healthcare consumers, but practitioners who are listening to these biohackers. And maybe I think it's because of how it's presented. They almost feel like they're obligated now to start doing this stuff in their own lives if they're a healthcare consumer or a practitioner, or they feel obligated. Like, when the whole intermittent fasting stuff came up, everyone's intermittent fasting and all the practitioners are telling their patients to intermittent fast. And you and I both know intermittent fasting strategies do not work for everybody, right? And, you might have someone who fasts and they crash and burn. You might be able to work them to the point where they have that metabolic flexibility, and that's probably a desirable thing to do. But to present intermittent fasting as kind of a solution for all metabolic disorders without having some nuances that says, well, let's be a little picky about who we do it with and how and when we do that. I think it's very reactionary. And this is one of the issues that I take with a lot of the more popular biohackers. And again, I'm not trying to put down their efforts and their passion and all that kind of stuff, because I do think that there's good that can be taken away from all of it.
For sure.
But number one, they don't have the clinical background to go, wait a minute, this might not apply to everybody. And how do you try to fit that to individual people? And, being careful in your languaging to make sure that people understand that whatever the strategy is, whether it's, the cold exposure, sauna, cycling hot and cold, intermittent fasting strategies, these are just tools that may or may not be applicable. And it's not like we all have to go out and start doing this with our patients just because someone who's garnered some degree of authority on social media or YouTube says it in a very emphatic, very, well, the research says this, and therefore this is how it is. That doesn't always work that way when you live in the clinical world.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with that. And I think, Steve, it's something powerful. When I started working with a lot of the professional athletes, a lot of the Dallas Stars and some Olympians and that sort of thing, is what always interests me. This is kind of what I see a lot of on Instagram now, like, just because you're in shape doesn't give you the authority to tell anybody that what you do is good for you.
Right.
As we know, like professional athletes, being healthy and having the best performance don't necessarily equate. So again, you look, for example, at somebody like Lance Armstrong. Now, in his world, when they stripped him of all his medals, of all his Tour de France and everything else, they couldn't give it to the next 10 people because they all had the same test positive scores.
That's right.
So, meaning they were performing at the highest level and they will do anything.
Yeah.
to perform at the highest level. Is that healthy? I don't know. We see all the female bodybuilders who have incredibly low body fat. And we know from a hormone perspective, is that healthy? Six packs on females, is that healthy? Looks great. Again, and if that makes them and gives you perception of worth, and then great. But that should not be somebody who's doing that doesn't necessarily know what it is to be healthy. That's part one, I would say. And then part two, on your last statement, I would say that the biohackers, as opposed to you and I and our colleagues, aren't measuring the pre's and the posts with specific markers. And I want to highlight one thing, and I know you're already on board with this and understand it, but turmeric obviously is an incredibly powerful anti-inflammatory. It has this ability to modulate these inflammatory cytokines. It's very well documented throughout the literature. Is it good for everybody? Well, in theory, we would say, of course it is. Yeah. Everybody should be on turmeric. Everybody should take it. Everybody should be on curcumin. Until you have the patient who, and this is well published as well, is that some patients develop autoimmune hepatitis from turmeric, right? I mean, so the point becomes is that beneficial to them? Is turmeric really this carte blanche? Everybody can do this, and I think that's probably where in the biohacking world, again, you can deliver this information and people can implement, but how do you know if it's heading in the right direction or not? Right. And I think that there has to be a goalpost that doesn't move all the time. It needs to be like, this is kind of the direction we're heading. Is the advice that we're giving you and the interventions and the modalities that we're providing, are they moving you towards that goalpost? And I think that a lot of times some individuals, and the same thing with vitamin C, for example, right? Like high dose vitamin C for the immune system. Is that a good thing? Sure it is.
In general.
Unless you have a G6PD enzyme deficiency, then you're going to develop a hemolytic anemia. No bueno. That's probably not the best, right? So I think that, again, I think patients, clients are now so much more educated than ever before, and that's powerful. And of course, that challenges us to continuously step up our game, hear what they're saying, and then how do we help coach them in saying, yes, that what you heard was impactful and maybe applicable to you. However, you have a G6PD deficiency, therefore doing high dose vitamin C for you is probably not the best scenario.
Right.
Or if you have agglutination from, you have like a cold, it's, the name's escaping me right now, but it's if cold you can get a cold hemolytic anemia, right? So if you're exposed to cold temperatures, you will develop a hemolytic anemia. Right. Well, maybe for you then, taking a deep dive into the cold bath 4 a.m. every morning, because that's what someone's suggesting to you, it may probably not the best for you.
Yeah. I had when I did I interviewed Datis for the first episode on the podcast, and we talked a little bit about the danger in reading research. Number one is, you and I and most people are not trained in reading research, and it's very easy to read a conclusion in an abstract and then form an opinion that then changes or directs what you do clinically. But, even let's assume for the moment that we have some reasonable degree of ability to read research and tell the difference between good study design, bad study design, whatever. There's a problem, even with well-designed studies, in taking aggregated data and averages over large populations of people that represent, say, normative distributions of some kind of phenomena or problem, again, over large differences or large populations. Taking that averaged aggregate large scale data and then assuming that what they found in the study is actually what's happening in that patient that's sitting right in front of you, either in your office or on a Zoom call, something like this. And I think I think that's a big problem. Just because a meta-analysis of multiple studies concludes X, Y, and Z in large populations doesn't necessarily mean, again, that it's applicable to that one person. And so I'm at a point where I've kind of transitioned from I don't know what I don't know to I know that I don't know a lot of stuff. And I'm a little bit concerned because I like to read research like you. I've got that insatiable thirst for knowledge and information, and I love to integrate it into my own thought process, change what I do on a daily basis, and I like to share that as well, right? Hence the love for teaching. But gosh, I think I just wonder. I wonder how much of what we do is like the results we get is just dumb luck, because we're doing something that tends to be favorable for most people. And that person that I'm working with just tends to fall within maybe the first standard deviation of some problem. Whereas if they were outside of that, what I was trying to do was actually either not going to help or maybe be deleterious, like you said, with, hey, some people take turmeric and they get autoimmune hepatitis. So I don't know. What do you think? Do you ever think about those kind of challenges when it comes to translating research into practical clinical applications?
Trust the science.
Trust the science. That's right. I follow the science.
Yeah, which, obviously that's brought a lot of things to light over the last little bit. And that's why, it is interesting. Datis obviously has done an amazing job stepping up, and talk about another individual cursed with the insatiable appetite, and going to Harvard and getting his PhD and just looking at the research. And as you just said, the more you know you don't know. And I think that, again, looking at this research and saying, what's the bias? Who's paying for the study? I think a lot of that over the last couple of years here with everything that happened with COVID, I think that's probably an open eye awareness to a lot of people, especially friends and family back home in Canada, who, they were under severe lockdown with all of that. And I think that, so what does the research say? So I know from myself, a lot of times what I'm doing is I'm looking more at that peer-reviewed literature for show me some cases, give me the anecdotal, show me what happened with a patient who had this, because something's happening here that I'm unaware of.
Yeah.
And let me search the database for why would their liver enzymes be so high when they're doing everything right. They're taking turmeric, they're doing the cold water baths, they're intermittent fasting, they're meditating, they're doing yoga, they're doing it all.
Yeah.
What is driving this? And so I think this whole model of what's published, what's the bias, is it true today? Because I think the whole world of eggs will teach us that, right? Again, so what's the bias? Eggs are good for you, eggs are bad for you. And so I think we can only do what we can do, right? And as you just said, that you continuously shift your model based on the best of what we perceive to be true, based on what we're presented with. So if I can just take a turn here for a second, just kind of talk about how thyroid, and iodine in the thyroid. And obviously there's a great divide in the world of thyroid management for, do you take iodine or don't you take iodine? And I think from our model, yourself, myself, but Datis Karazian, and our one model is, there's a lot of research in the world that shows you everywhere in the world where there is iodine deficiency, if you prevent that and give everybody iodine, they get rid of iodine deficiency, which is great, but it trips autoimmune thyroid.
Right.
Okay. Well, then you have the other model that says, well, that's not necessarily the case. Iodine is going to help with and they go through their model. And to me, as the practitioner, I have to be able to help make a decision with the patient of how to best guide them.
Mm-hmm.
Doctor, should I or should I not take iodine? And then, of course, as a chiropractor, well, in this, in the state that you're in, we can't necessarily recommend medications or these sort of things. But here's what we feel to be true: that if you take iodine, there's a potential that it could go and trip autoimmune disease in you. It may not. Maybe you take iodine and you do great. But I don't know if that's going to happen for you. I don't know if you take iodine, I don't know which way you want to go. So here's what it is. Here are some research articles that say this. Here are some research articles that say that. My perspective is we're here trying to do everything we can to calm the autoimmune scenario. And my perception is that I don't think iodine is probably the best way to go.
Right.
That's my perception. Now, I had a doctor at one of the seminars who was in this other
camp
belief paradigm. And they're like, no, iodine, not. And he was just like really on top of me. And so I kept saying to him, just wait till after I present the information about iodine autoimmune. And then here's what I feel is important about the research, Steve, is if you see research and it goes against what you feel to be true, are you willing to change? So for that practitioner who was really becoming aggressive with me because his belief system in iodine for thyroid was so strong that when I showed him the evidence that said there's a lot of cases worldwide, pick a country, that autoimmune can trip. So what I challenged him to do was to go home and to start to say that to your patients, that, look, this is what we do. This is our model. And if I give you this, wait a minute, there's a chance that you could trip and have an autoimmune disorder. What do you think? Instead of just saying, I'm going to ignore all that because it doesn't fit in my little paradigm, and I'm just going to ignore that. I'm just going to give you this anyway. To me, that's malpractice. I feel that that doctor knowingly could be doing harm versus somebody who doesn't have that. Maybe somebody who's given the iodine is completely unaware of this autoimmune situation that could prevail. If you're blind to it and you don't know it, that's different than knowing it and choosing to be blind to it.
Right.
And I think, I think that's what research is trying to do, right? Always ask questions. You can't silence the people who are asking questions. You can't silence the experts. We have to keep digging, and we have to keep using the research, and it helps us to understand. And it may not be applicable to everybody, but it just allows us to maybe challenge our own biases, what we feel to be true. So I don't really know if I don't know if that really answered.
That was the long and winding road. Well, yes. Again, a couple of things come up. We were talking earlier, and I totally agree with you that the knowledge base or the education level of potential new clients for me, they know so much more than they did 10 years ago. And so I've seen a massive change in the sophistication of the people who contact me wanting one-on-one help. I've also seen a big change in the sophistication of people going to functional medicine seminars. Right. And you can just pick a couple of things come to mind. The number of people who know at least the fundamentals about something like leaky gut or phenomena of something like biofilm. Back in 2010, when I was starting to teach on this stuff, if I said, how many docs here have heard of biofilm, for example, like if one person in a room of 50 put their hand up, that would have been a lot. Now, in fact, I taught last year in California, and the concept of biofilm came up. I asked that same question. We had about 45 people in the group. And I'd say about 2/3 of the class put their hand up and said, yeah, I know something about biofilm. When I said, well, how many of you are actively addressing that in your clinical protocols? Maybe half of the people who had raised their hand still had their hand up. And so going back to what you were saying, like, teaching, you and I have been teaching functional blood chemistry analysis for a very long time now. I don't teach it the same way, and I'm sure you don't either now as I do 10 years ago, 15 years ago, because docs need more information. They need more detail because they come in already knowing some of the fundamentals, and they have a lot of really good quality questions. So I guess that's a long way of me getting to you saying, how have you seen functional medicine change since you've been involved in that?
One of the biggest things I'm seeing, Steve, and I'm sure you are as well, is, to me, the number of medical providers, medical doctors, who are sitting in these seminars.
Yeah.
So when we teach functional endocrinology, it amazes me the number of OBGYNs that are sitting in the group trying to embrace and understand the model. I mean, the one that hit me, Steve, was I was teaching in Arizona, and there was a hematologist oncologist. And same within New York, there's a oncologist there. And I'm thinking, like, these are blood specialists. These are the top of the top, and here I am, a chiropractor, teaching a blood chemistry seminar to a hematologist.
Yeah.
And the hematologist is taking more notes than anyone.
Yeah.
And really, you can see his paradigm of, I mean, you and I, we look and say, "Ooh, your iron's a little low. You're becoming borderline anemic," and he's dealing with individuals who have no blood left. Their cancer has wiped out their bone marrow, and he's like, "Yeah, that's not too bad." His paradigm of what's like sound the alarms and our paradigm of sound the alarms are completely different.
Completely different. Right.
He's waking up to this world of, "Doc, in your perception, what do you feel about X, Y, and Z?" I remember I was teaching a neurology seminar in San Francisco years ago, and one of our good colleagues from Korea, who was a neurosurgeon, would fly from Korea to come watch me teach a seminar in San Francisco on neurology. A neurosurgeon, I mean, and he was, the one time he was sitting in class and he had an IV bag because he developed an infection and he had cellulitis all through his face.
Oh, no.
And I asked him, "What is that?" He says, "Glutathione." I'm like, "All right, whatever that is." I have no idea. I'd never heard of glutathione at the time.
Yeah.
And so, to me, to answer your question, I think what's really changed is the amount of credentialed medical providers, nurse practitioners, medical doctors, nurses. Our world is functional medicine has, for acupuncturists and chiropractors, dietitians, nutritionists, that whole model, we've kind of always embraced this. But to see the amount of medical providers now is really just, I used to say baffling, but now it's just, to me, it's impressive, because I think they are realizing that just giving a drug for every symptom is not what they signed up for. That's not why they went into medicine. They truly, really want to help people.
Yeah. And
I think they're realizing that in the paradigm that they're stuck in the current medical model with the insurance base, and you can only see so many people in this amount of time, and just, it's not, they know it's not. And so, I mean, some of these seminars you go to now, I mean, there's 500 people at the seminar, and the majority are medical practitioners of how do we do a better job. So I love that. So I think that's one thing I've really seen that's changed. So I think, yes, the level of competency and the depth of knowledge that people have gained over the last few years has certainly increased. As you were talking about biofilm, It's funny you bring up biofilm, because I remember when I first got into this, and you were already teaching this before I was, and had lots of exposure. And I mean, you were my rock. You were the guy I leaned on. I started this functional medicine stuff. I'm like, "Steve, what is a biofilm? Steve, what? My ferritin's 800. My dad's is 2,000. What do you think?" You're like, "I think you have hemochromatosis." I mean, like, to me, I would call you, how do we dose like the iron? So when I first started in this, you know, you were my guy. I leaned on you for everything. And then it's funny because I remember you saying that once I got exposed to this, you turned to Kathy and went, this guy's going to be teaching this stuff in no time. Like, it was, you knew that, and it was.
I think I said to her, Tom's going to be teaching inside a year. And I think it was something like 6 months.
Right. Yeah. So it went from my first seminar to like 6 months later, because then once I got that door open to me, I was like, I'm in, all in. And it was, again, the insatiable appetite up to 2 a.m. every morning, just trying to understand and gain knowledge. And, but yeah, so I think the level of knowledge base for everyone who participates now, and I'll never forget, Steve, the knowledge base too of a mom who's had a child who's had some incredible health challenges, and she's taken it upon herself to learn all the biohacking, to gain some credentialing through a nutrition degree, who sits in the front row of my brain chemistry class as a mom who took her baby home and the baby was happy and healthy, and then had an anoxic situation, and now is completely 100% dependable on her mom for everything. And that mom is learning, how do we put all these supplements together and develop these leaky gut protocols or biofilm or whatever, and how do we put that into my daughter's gastric tube so I can feed her? And to me, I'm saying, like, tell me more, because I don't have that experience. What is it? Tell me, how does that work? And one of my patients, Kevin, who wrote a fantastic book, you know, he's become a biohacker, and he's learned so much from his brain injury and from being a client in the office, that, you know, he's now on stage and he's presenting, but he can bring it from I've never had a brain, well, some would argue, I mean, I've never had a brain injury, right? But he, you know, he was in a coma. And so his experience and what he's gained through our model of functional neurology, functional medicine, and now he helps others that have been through these. So he's got something that I don't have. He's got a true clinical experience. And so the knowledge base of individuals attending, the knowledge base of the medical providers who are now attending because they want a different model, I think all of that has changed. And then I think we all just feed off one another. You know, I know you, when someone comes up to you at a seminar and says, hey, what do you know about this? And you look at them like, I have no idea what that is. But now that you open that rabbit hole for me, I'm diving deep. And
I'm gonna own it.
Go down and I think we feel a responsibility too, right? As a practitioner who's the instructor, that someone asks me that question again, I'm gonna have an answer, or at least some sort of knowledge base on that. I don't know if that's from a ego standpoint. I don't think so. I think it's from there's your insatiable appetite for knowledge. What is that? What are you talking about?
That's right. You want to know for yourself, for sure.
Yeah. And how does that help my patient? I'm in. I'm diving. You know, and I think, what about you, Steve? I mean, what have you seen from the functional med? What do you think else has changed?
Exactly the same thing. And in fact, I've had this conversation with a couple of people that I've interviewed for the podcast, and we tend to agree the increased sophistication of clients that are coming in asking for help, increased sophistication of practitioners in functional medicine seminars, increased participation from people kind of jumping out of conventional medicine and seeing things through a different lens. And you know what, a lot of this actually makes me start thinking, because we've kind of teased around the edges of, you know, like, what's your clinical model? Back when you and I first started learning this stuff and then taking on teaching responsibilities, there weren't many groups that were teaching functional medicine, certainly not the way that we understand functional medicine, which then kind of begs the question, like, what is functional medicine? Because there's no, you know, Jeff Bland coined the term, and now he doesn't use that anymore. He's kind of ported over into, personalized lifestyle medicine, which I like that as well. Anybody can do anything that's quasi-natural and call it functional medicine. But if you were I guess I have two questions. How would you define functional medicine? And what do you think? Do you think that there should be a single clinical model through which the principles and concepts of functional medicine are delivered? And let me just give you an example to orient you. Like in our blood chemistry course that you and I both taught hundreds of times, we talk about a hierarchy of physiology, right? Blood flow is king. You have to be able to deliver oxygen to your tissues. And so we want to rule out anemias and then dysglycemias, chronic stress chemistry, and so on and so on. And so we teach this clinical model, which is generally how I practice, of you want to do a general assessment and then enter into someone's biochemistry at the lowest common denominator that has the most leverage to change the most things. So yeah, let me back out and ask you two questions. Like, how would you define functional medicine? And then do you think there should be a single unified clinical model that all people who say they do functional medicine should be following? Or are there degrees of freedom, and do people have wiggle room to do that and still call themselves a functional medicine practitioner?
That second question is a hard one, right? That is,
Yeah.
I think that I don't like the idea necessarily of a governing body that's going to mandate that everybody has to do X, Y, and Z, because then I think we enter that danger zone of not being able to have the clinical freedom to introduce what you feel is relevant and important.
Right.
So I think that is, but again, but if you don't have somewhat of a governing body, if you will, then anybody and anything can be anything. You know? So
let me just interject here for a second and ask your opinion. Like, I totally get the idea of not having it mandated from on high. Like, you call yourself functional medicine, you therefore must do X, Y, Z. I think when we make statements like that, maybe it boils down to individual modalities, or let's say clinical tactics. Like I'm going to run blood chemistry and I'm going to prescribe supplements based on that, or I'm going to do a symptom survey and prescribe supplements based on that. Do you think that there's anything that should be not mandated, that's too strong of a word, but almost like an expectation? Like if we look at the primary drivers of chronic inflammation and chronic diseases, we can divide them into three main things, like your diet choices, your lifestyle choices, each of which have subcategories, and then your exposome, right? Your environmental exposures and how your body handles that. And it almost seems to me that, we could go up to a very high level and say, listen, if you're going to call yourself a functional medicine practitioner, you should be doing something in each of those three domains. But what you do in the depth of each of those is really kind of up to you. I mean, do you
right.
You understand what I'm saying?
I understand what you're saying. And I think, in our profession, the chiropractic profession has been arguing this forever.
Yeah.
Just within our own profession, like, what is a chiropractor? So your question of what is functional medicine is the same thing as in our profession. What is a chiropractor? Well, a lot of people think chiropractor is you crack your low back when it's sore. Okay. Well, again, like in the state of Texas, I don't use the term functional medicine. I don't treat patients because treatment is a medical term. Mm-hmm. I don't do functional medicine. I do nothing with medicine. So again, like I'm being dictated to like what I'm allowed to say. Yes. Under my scope of practice, right? So there's that kind of nuance. But even under that, I mean, if you say you go to a chiropractor, you and I know that when they say they're going to see a chiropractor, the scope of who and what they can see is so vastly different. Where you have some practitioners who don't even not necessarily examine the patient in the true clinical sense of tap or reflex, but they're looking at their eye and their tongue. Mm. I look at somebody's tongue and I'm just looking, is it going right or left? I'm just thinking about, do they have a nerve lesion? And somebody else is looking at it and analyzing it. And then they use the energies and the auras and the waves, and they adjust their patients by not even ever touching them. I mean, so how does that relate to the functional medicine world? I think that's what we're seeing, right? Like everybody can call themselves a functional medicine practitioner with or without a degree. And I think that can be both beneficial as well as detrimental. I think beneficial from the point that allows you a lot of freedom to look and see what you're going after, but maybe from the patient perspective, the client perspective, someone who thinks they're maybe going to a functional practitioner, they think they're going to have X amount of testing and they're expecting one thing, and they go in and they get something that's completely opposite. Doesn't mean it's not good.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that, I mean, I think we could talk about that for hours. What is functional medicine? I think really at the core of all of it, I think everybody in the world of functional medicine has come back to what the chiropractic paradigm and Fred Barge and BJ Pomeroy's talked about with, what's the root cause? And if you can identify whatever the problem is, and if you can identify the problem in chiropractic, of course, we called it that subluxation term, and that's why we kind of coined the term metabolic subluxation. What's the root cause from a metabolic standpoint? But if you can identify it and remove that interference, then the innate intelligence of the body will do its thing. I remember being in chiropractic college, going to a seminar, and the guy saying, the power that made the body heals the body, and remove the interference and everything will be better. And I'm thinking, so what you're saying is if you crack someone's back, you're saying that their cancer is going to go away. And I was so narrow, and I was so judgmental. And I think from in communication with you, Steve, I always walk away with a little bit more peace in my life, and it allows me to open up my scope of view a lot more than it's always been, and try to appreciate what the exposure is. And I think that the world of functional medicine and that chiropractor who stood up there, really what they were always saying is not necessarily what the subluxation is. That's just one form of interference. The interference could be the relationship in your life. If it's a negative relationship, that wears on you. And that's the interference that needs to be. And I don't know about you, Steve, but to me, it's amazing. I like data, and I know you like data. Show me the blower, show me the numbers and all this. And we're going through all this. And then you have another practitioner in that audience saying, I practice functional medicine, but I really tap into what's going on in their life. What's really going on? Are you happy? Are you sleeping? Do you sleep on a soft pillow that's not full of regret? And how much does all of that play into it? So what is their interference? So I think what is functional medicine? I think it's always getting to the root cause, identifying what the interference is, removing that interference, so allowing them to I'm always cautious with the word heal in the state of Texas as well. Can't use that word either. But what is it that's going to identify and be able to remove that from them and take that weight off their shoulders so that they can really thrive? So to me, that's what functional medicine is. I think it's just identifying what the chiropractic principle is, identifying what the root cause is, removing that, and allowing full health expression. What about you? I'd be interested what your
it's a work in progress, right? Because you try to formulate some thoughts which in the moment seem applicable and relevant and cogent, and then you think of something else 10 days later, a year later, and you're like, no, I got to rethink things. And so lately what's been in my mind, because I think about the practitioner. Let's say there's someone who's working with someone who's got chronic health issues, and maybe they run blood chemistry and prescribe some supplements, but they never delve into someone's lifestyle, their psycho-emotional states, their stressors. They never look at daily activity and exercise patterns and sleep habits and, the balance of being sedentary versus moving. Are they really a functional medicine practitioner? I mean, in one sense, if the definition of functional medicine is you have to go into diet, lifestyle, and environmental exposure to some degree, regardless of which tools you use to do that. So does that mean that person's not doing functional medicine, or they're just not doing all that they could be? And maybe you could label them a bad practitioner. And I don't mean bad in the sense of they're hurting people, but bad in the sense that they're not encouraging change and progress by doing everything that they could potentially do. And I guess maybe that begs the question, like, for some people, is it enough to run blood chemistry and give supplements? Does that change enough for some people? The answer is yes. Sure. But for some, it's paltry. Like for, the person who has a history of, PTSD, they were mistreated as a child or as a young person, and they've got some degree of mesolimbic plasticity, and they're locked into this inflammatory loop with elements of insomnia and anxiety and OCD. And we see these people a lot, at least I do in my practice. To think that I'm just going to supplement them and fix all that, that's unrealistic. And it's very short-sighted. So I don't know. I don't have the answer. I'm not saying like I have the answer of what it is, but I tend to think along the lines of that whatever you do that you're calling functional medicine better be in alignment with the intelligent design of the body.
Agreed.
And it has to address the most common primary drivers of disease, which, at least I think where we are right now, is looking at, like your epigenetic and your phenotypic expression, right? And pretty much everything, I'm convinced at this point, that everything that happens to us with our health and our wellness is how our diet, lifestyle, and environment influence genetic expression.
Sure.
That's the way I see things right now. Now, ask me again in 6 months, I might tell you something different.
Well, that raises the question, right? So with the genes, and again, that analogy of the genes are the gun, if you will, but it's your environment that pulls the trigger type of thing. Like, we know that just because you have the BRCA gene doesn't guarantee that you're going to have cancer. It increases your likelihood. Doesn't mean. Same with Parkinson's, and same with MTHFR and all these other ones. But circling back for 1 sec, Steve, to what you just said there, again, so are you a functional medicine practitioner if you're not offering lifestyle and dietary changes? And I would have always said yes. And then I had the one patient, came in, a young girl, she's 16 or something. She's in there with her mom. And I'm trying to navigate my initial thing. Like, are you willing to, if we say to do testing, are you going to do testing? Are you willing to do that? Yes. Kind of give me all these yeses, so I'll accept you as a patient type of scenario. You understand the model I'm talking about?
I do. Yeah.
And I'm like, are you willing to change your diet and lifestyle? If we think the gluten's a problem and this is a problem, are you willing to? And the mom said, listen, my daughter has an eating disorder. She was dying, right, with anorexia. We just got out of the hospital. She was in there for 2 weeks. They were trying to save her life. And if we leave this office and my daughter says, I want a Big Mac, we're having a Big Mac. Because we can't teach her this is good food and this is bad food. For her, she was dying because her perception of what food was going to do to her.
Yeah.
And that, Steve, was a wake-up call for me. I can offer what I think is going to be beneficial to you as the patient. But if they deny that, do I say, well, that's it, you don't meet the criteria, you're not coming in, because this is just what we do here. I used to think that.
Yeah.
That case made me change all of that quickly.
It almost sounds like you've adopted a paradigm where you understand, first and foremost, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And some people embrace change very willingly and very easily, and others don't. Then you have all the blind spots that you have to deal with some people because they simply don't know what they don't know. So it sounds like to me, rather than maybe trying to simplify your business model to make it easier to employ certain tactics, help a big number of people, you're looking at people as individuals, you're meeting them where they are and trying to understand where they are in the continuum of all these different things. and trying to figure out how you bring them along with baby steps before you can start running and jumping. Is that kind of an accurate?
I would say that's
way
very accurate, very accurate. And, you know, when you join coaching groups and you're trying to do a certain model and you're trying to copy what somebody else is doing, and, you know, and this is the way it is, you know, it's a dictatorship. You know,
Yeah.
like, this is the way it's going to be in my practice. And if you don't like it, then too bad. Now, some patients, they need that. They need those guideposts. They need you to say, especially to me, the individuals that are a diabetic, type 2 diabetic, and they're that way simply because of lifestyle choice, they need somebody to say, hey, this is exactly what we're doing. This is how we're going to do it. But you have those other cases, as the young lady with anorexia we just spoke about. And, you know, when you were talking about the psychology and the issues, the PTSD, I had one patient, I'll never forget her either. You know, she was sold into child pornography by her father at age 2.
Wow.
And by that time, she had been raped by every male member of her family. And she's coming into me for some help. And, you know, I'm absolutely devastated. And I'm trying to think about, yeah, gluten might be bad for you. And we're going to check to see, you know, like, to me, I had to understand that model and really, like, you're not coming here for me to help you with that specifically. I hope what I'm going to try to do is identify, but, you know, if you do have anemia, that can compromise your ability to get better with the advice and care that your psychotherapist is trying to offer you. If your B12 is low, that can impact your neuronal function. If your glutathione levels, you know, all these different. So I'm going to help you with that to try to improve the quality of your physiology so that you can accept the other care that you're getting.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree with everything you had just said there. I mean, those are the concepts. You know, we can't be the dictator. You have to. I'm better now at meeting patients where they're at and tell me, what is it you truly want? And is it something that I think I can help you get there? And if I can't, then, you know, see somebody else who's in functional medicine, and they might be doing something that's, you know, astral travel and these other things. I have no idea what any, but for some of them, that's what they need to get better.
Yeah. And that's why in my own mind, I'm trying to sort through, you know, thinking through what functional medicine is at different levels of stratification. And I'm starting to like the idea that at a 30,000 foot view, if you're not dealing with diet, lifestyle, and your exposome, then you're missing something. Like, you know, maybe you can still call it functional medicine, but I think we tend to get trapped into thinking about the specific modalities of how I deliver care, whether that's lab interpretation or supplementation or doing a detox or whatever the case is, because, and, you know, there's, you know, 10 different ways to skin a rabbit, as the old saying goes. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I tell people I have my own opinions. I have my own thoughts. I have my lens, my perspective, my biases. At the end of the day, I don't care how you get better. I think it's going to be like this. But I'll tell you this, and we should probably look at the time and clue up pretty soon.
Oh yeah.
Maybe I can get you back and we can continue the conversation. But you know, it was the same year. It was not long after I moved to Tampa, and it was back when I had a brick and mortar. And I had 2 clients I was working with. They didn't know each other, but they had very similar cases. And one lady she was an autoimmune thyroid case. And initially she got some really good results just with diet changes and supplementation. And she got stuck. You know, she just stopped progressing. She wasn't flaring up. She just wasn't getting better. And no matter how we changed her diet and tweaked that or tweaked her supplementation protocol, no matter what labs we reran and what we adjusted with her supplements, nothing made a difference. And then she confided in me one day that her dad was in hospice. And every day she woke up just thinking, is today the day my dad is going to die?
Mm.
And I went, oh, okay. I said, so here's the deal. My job right now is just to keep you from falling apart. And
Right.
what's going to happen is your dad's going to pass, you're going to grieve, and things are going to start getting better again. And that's exactly what happened. And we didn't change
Right.
anything from that point forward. And then again, around the same time, I had another lady who I don't think she was a thyroid case. I can't remember what her main complaints were, but we also got to a point where things got stuck. And then I was pretty much at my wit's end. Like, I don't know what to do at this point. And then all of a sudden she texted me and say, like, hey, this week has been so much better. And so I said, well, what changed? And she said, I went through an online journaling program that centered around forgiveness. And it turned out that she had been wronged by many people in her life, and she was holding on to that. It made her bitter. And once she went through the process of letting all that stuff go, her physiology changed. And this is, such a powerful thing. And I'll say this one thing, and really, you should be talking because you're the guest, but it's kind of hard not to jump in and kind of share some
Sure.
insights. I was at the gym working out yesterday, and I was listening to, I don't know if you know who Kara Fitzgerald is. She's a naturopath. She's linked in with the IFM.
Oh,
She
Kara,
does,
yeah.
her own research. Yeah. So she's got this, she was interviewing, and gosh, I can't remember his name, but he was heavily involved in starting Cleveland Clinic's Center for Functional Medicine. Can't remember his name. And he was talking about that two of the most powerful drivers of wellness and longevity are passion and posse, community. I love how he said it. It was like passion and posse. And I like stopped and like pulled up my notes on my phone and like passion and posse. Gosh, I mean, that just captures it, because we know how powerful, like as powerful as a diagnostic into supplementation program or approach is, as powerful as an approach is to find someone's ideal diet. If you have somebody who has no purpose in life, who feels like they'll never be the person that they should be, they've given up on all their goals and their passions, and they have no one around them that they care about or cares about them, and they don't have the sense of, I'm part of something bigger than myself. I don't care how you change their diet or what supplements you give them, you're only going to get so far.
Right. That's what I'm saying. That's my uncles. That's my dad. That's my mom. That's the, not that my mom's supposed to, just my couple of my uncles there, but irregardless of all these things that we think is going to be best for them.
Yeah.
They're just going along. They're just doing, I mean, my mom was saying that growing up in Scotland, they would eat tar off the road as chewing gum, because they didn't have chewing gum, It's like
those Scottish.
Yeah. So anyway.
That's amazing. Well, listen, we've been nattering on for quite a long time here now. I'd love to have you back again and just talk more.
For sure. Love it.
Yeah.
Maybe when you come down and visit, we can do a in-house, in person.
Yeah, I know I know what's going to happen is my time is going to start running out very, very short, but I'll try to make that happen. I'll talk to Kathy. She'll be back here any minute now, and we'll kind of get our schedule sorted out for the next month. But I'd love to. Yeah, I'd love to come down and hang out.
Always a pleasure, Steve. Listen, I was sincere. When my mom comes to town, or I hang out with my mom a little bit, she's the most patient and caring, and she teaches me a lot about patience. And I walk away from that, and I'm patient and calm for about 3 minutes, and then my innate goes. And same thing with you. I always find that when I'm living with you, your gift, your ability, your vocabulary, your ability to hold on and to express the language, I think that's from all your writing. I'm hoping one day I get to read that book. I hope one day you release it. I want to read the story of the almost like the Harry Potter type world that you were creating, and the gift and the ability to be able to think and to do something completely different than your day in and day out.
Yeah, I tell you, it's always somewhere in the back of my mind, and I keep saying to Kathy, like, if I get a break, if my schedule with work, and if I have a large chunk of time, I'm going to go back and finich that project. But I appreciate it. Those are very kind words.
Yeah, I just want to thank you, because you've been an incredible mentor to me, without a doubt. So our friendship's been great. We've known each other a long time now. 1992, I can't believe it. That's 30 years now, right?
I know, it's crazy.
So
I'm not even 30 years old. I don't know how that happens. Well,
all right,
brother,
Steve, very good.
it was
Thank
good
you.
talking to you. And then we'll catch another time and we'll do this again.
Very good. Thanks, Steve.